There are moments in life when a single sentence reveals more about the person speaking than the person being insulted. On an autumn evening inside one of the most luxurious mansions in Connecticut, surrounded by crystal chandeliers, polished silver, and guests whose fortunes could buy entire neighborhoods, a billionaire raised his glass, looked across the dining room, and laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She's too dumb to even read a wine label." The laughter that followed echoed through the hall, and for a brief second, the woman standing beside the table lowered her eyes without saying a word. To everyone present, she was simply another maid serving another dinner. They saw the uniform, the serving tray, and the quiet smile that came with years of invisible work. What they did not see was the lifetime of sacrifice, education, heartbreak, and discipline hidden behind that silence. They certainly did not imagine that within the next few minutes, the same woman they dismissed would become the only person capable of saving a business agreement worth tens of millions of dollars. Even more astonishing, the very man who mocked her would soon struggle to meet her eyes as every guest around the table realized they had judged her entirely by appearance. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The evening had been organized to celebrate what many financial magazines called the deal of the year. Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire investor known for his confidence and his habit of speaking as though disagreement were impossible, had invited executives, attorneys, diplomats, and international partners to his estate. Every detail had been planned months in advance because one signature at the end of the night would expand his company into markets he had chased for years. The finest chefs had prepared the menu, the rarest wines had been selected from a private cellar, and every employee had been reminded that perfection was expected. Among the staff moving quietly through the room was a woman named Grace Carter, whose name almost nobody there knew. To the guests, she was simply part of the background, someone who appeared when glasses needed refilling and disappeared before anyone thanked her. Yet as she carried a tray from one side of the room to the other, she noticed every conversation, every nervous glance between executives, and every document resting beside polished dinner plates. She listened more than she spoke, and in rooms filled with powerful people, that often meant she understood far more than anyone suspected. Then the atmosphere shifted. One of the foreign executives lifted an old bottle of wine from the table and smiled before asking a question in a language unfamiliar to nearly everyone present. Several guests looked toward Ethan, expecting an answer, but his confident expression disappeared for just a moment. Another executive joined the conversation in a different language, and another followed with yet another. The translators who had assisted during earlier meetings were nowhere in sight, delayed by an unexpected problem outside the dining room. An awkward silence settled over the table as millions of dollars suddenly depended on communication that no one seemed able to provide. Ethan forced a laugh and tried to lighten the mood, but the uncertainty remained. The same guests who had laughed at his joke only moments earlier now exchanged uneasy looks. And then, standing quietly beside the table, Grace slowly lifted her head. Every eye in the room turned toward the woman they had dismissed. Before anyone could stop her, she opened her mouth and answered in the language that had left the room silent. The conversation that followed would change the entire evening, embarrass one of the richest men in America, and raise a question no one around that table had bothered to ask until it was almost too late. Why was a woman with such extraordinary abilities working as a maid in the first place? To understand the answer, and to discover the secret she had carried for years, we have to go back to the beginning. To understand why that dining room fell silent, you first have to understand the man who believed silence belonged to everyone else. Ethan Caldwell had spent 3 decades building an empire that stretched across real estate, technology investments, and international finance. Business magazines called him brilliant. Television hosts called him fearless. His admirers called him self-made, while his critics quietly argued that success had convinced him he could never be wrong. His estate sat behind towering iron gates on hundreds of acres of perfectly maintained land, where cameras watched every entrance and security personnel recognized every license plate before it reached the front drive. Guests arriving that evening passed fountains imported from Europe, gardens designed by famous architects, and garages displaying automobiles that many people would spend several lifetimes trying to afford. Inside the mansion, Priceless artwork decorated the walls, crystal chandeliers reflected across marble floors, and a private staff moved with practiced precision so that every glass, every plate, and every chair appeared exactly where it should. For Ethan, this was more than a home. It was evidence that he had won. He believed wealth was the clearest measurement of intelligence, and he often judged strangers within seconds of meeting them. In his mind, successful people earned respect while everyone else earned instructions. He often told friends that he had an extraordinary talent for reading people, claiming he could identify ambition, weakness, honesty, and intelligence simply by observing how someone dressed, walked, or spoke. The executives around his table admired that confidence, even if some privately questioned it. To Ethan, status determined value, titles revealed ability, and expensive suits carried more authority than quiet humility. He had built a world where nearly everyone agreed with him, and after years of hearing his own opinions echoed back by employees and business partners, he no longer considered the possibility that first impressions could be dangerously wrong. While the guests admired paintings worth millions and discussed investments across continents, another world existed only a few feet away, hidden behind polished service doors and narrow hallways connecting the dining room to the kitchen. That was where Grace Carter spent most of the evening. She arrived before sunrise and often left long after the last light inside the mansion had gone dark. She moved quietly through crowded rooms without interrupting conversations, replacing glasses before they emptied and clearing plates before anyone asked. Years of experience had taught her that the best service was almost invisible. Most guests never looked directly at her face. Some handed her empty glasses without making eye contact, while others continued conversations as though she were another piece of furniture decorating the room. She accepted every task with professionalism, thanked those who showed kindness, and never reacted when others dismissed her. New employees often assumed she lacked confidence because she spoke so little, but those who worked alongside her noticed something different. During short breaks, she would occasionally read books left behind in waiting rooms or quietly study newspapers from different countries before returning to work as though nothing unusual had happened. She listened carefully whenever international visitors spoke among themselves, and there were moments when the slightest expression crossed her face, suggesting she understood conversations nobody expected her to follow. Yet she never volunteered information, never sought attention, and never corrected anyone's assumptions. To nearly everyone gathered inside Ethan Caldwell's mansion that evening, she was simply another servant carrying trays through expensive rooms. The guests saw a servant. Only one person noticed something different. The remarkable thing about people who carry extraordinary stories is that they rarely announce them. They wake up before the rest of the world, complete ordinary routines, and disappear into crowds without anyone suspecting the journey that brought them there. Grace Carter was one of those people. Long before the guests at Ethan Caldwell's mansion arrived, while the streets were still quiet and the city lights reflected against empty sidewalks, she was already awake preparing for another exhausting day. Her mornings began before sunrise with a routine that had remained unchanged for years. Coffee brewed while she carefully organized her schedule, ironed her uniform, and reviewed a small notebook she kept inside her bag. After finishing one shift, she often traveled across town to complete another, accepting every extra hour available because every paycheck mattered. The people who hired her assumed she simply needed the money, but none of them understood that discipline had become part of her identity long before financial hardship entered her life. She rarely complained, never arrived late, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already overcome challenges far greater than carrying trays through elegant dining rooms. During the few moments when work slowed, while others reached for their phones or chatted with coworkers, Grace would find a quiet corner and open a book. Sometimes it was a history book borrowed from a public library. Other times it was a worn dictionary filled with handwritten notes in the margins. She read with complete concentration, underlining passages and occasionally writing unfamiliar expressions into her notebook before returning to work as though nothing unusual had happened. A younger employee once joked that she studied more than college students, but Grace simply smiled and closed the book without offering an explanation. To most people, she appeared reserved, almost invisible, yet there was an unmistakable calm about her that made those who paid close attention wonder what experiences had shaped her. Questions lingered without answers, Why would someone working long hours as a maid spend every free minute reading? Why did she treat every conversation as an opportunity to learn? And why did she seem completely unbothered by insults that would have left many others deeply offended? She carried herself not like someone defeated by life, but like someone patiently waiting for the right moment. At the end of each day, Grace returned to a modest apartment far removed from the luxury of Ethan Caldwell's estate. The building showed its age, the hallway lights flickered, and the furniture inside was simple but carefully maintained. On a small shelf sat several framed family photographs that she dusted regularly before placing them back in exactly the same positions. Visitors would have noticed something curious about the room. Tucked inside a drawer beside neatly organized papers was an old passport whose pages carried stamps from places far beyond the United States. Some had faded with time, while others remained perfectly visible, marking journeys across different continents and cultures. There were also postcards written in different languages, folded letters she had preserved for years, and a map with tiny markings that seemed to connect cities thousands of miles apart. She never spoke about them to coworkers and never volunteered stories about where she had been. Whenever someone asked about her past, she would politely change the subject and return to work. The mystery only deepened because nothing about her present seemed to match the clues left behind by her past. Somehow, somewhere, Grace Carter had lived a life that reached far beyond the walls of a mansion kitchen, but she guarded that history with remarkable care. And as the guests settled into their seats at Ethan Caldwell's extravagant dinner party, unaware of the woman quietly serving them, someone at the table asked a simple question that changed the entire evening. By 7 o'clock that evening, Ethan Caldwell's mansion had transformed into something that looked less like a private residence and more like the headquarters of global power. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway as chauffeurs opened doors for guests whose names frequently appeared on financial news programs and magazine covers. Investors responsible for billion-dollar portfolios greeted one another with practiced smiles. Diplomats exchanged handshakes that carried years of international relationships. Chief executives discussed expanding markets before even reaching the dining room. And foreign business partners quietly evaluated every detail of the evening. In their world, appearances mattered almost as much as numbers, and Ethan understood that better than anyone. Every painting on the wall, every antique sculpture, every piece of crystal, and every carefully selected bottle of wine had been chosen to communicate one message: success. The dinner itself was merely the setting for something much larger. Hidden beneath the elegant conversation was a negotiation that had occupied months of planning, countless meetings, and enormous financial risk. Only one final agreement remained, a signature that would secure an international partnership worth millions of dollars and open opportunities Ethan had pursued for years. The atmosphere was relaxed on the surface, but beneath the laughter and polite conversation, every participant understood that a single misunderstanding could change everything. As course after course arrived at the table, discussions shifted effortlessly between economics, politics, and international trade. Some guests compared experiences from overseas markets while others debated future investment opportunities, each trying to measure the confidence and intentions of the people sitting across from them. Ethan moved comfortably through every conversation, speaking with the assurance of a man accustomed to winning. Whenever someone complimented the evening, he accepted the praise as though excellence were simply expected from him. His confidence spread through the room, convincing many that the agreement was already complete even though the final documents remained unsigned beside polished silverware. Meanwhile, Grace Carter continued her work without drawing attention to herself. She refilled glasses before anyone noticed they were empty, replaced dishes with remarkable precision, and quietly stepped aside whenever conversations became animated. Several guests never looked directly at her, assuming she was simply another employee performing routine duties. Yet while they focused on negotiations, Grace listened carefully, recognizing accents from different parts of the world and following conversations that others assumed she could not possibly understand. Her expression never changed, and she gave no indication that the discussions unfolding around her carried meanings far beyond what most people in the room realized. Then an unexpected moment interrupted the carefully orchestrated evening. One of the foreign partners reached toward the center of the table and lifted an elegant bottle of vintage wine that had been selected from Ethan's private collection. Turning the bottle slowly beneath the chandelier, he smiled and pointed to an inscription printed in a language unfamiliar to many of the guests. Curious about its history, he asked if anyone could translate the wording and explain the significance written on the label. The conversation immediately paused as several executives glanced at one another, hoping someone else would answer first. Ethan examined the bottle briefly, but the confidence that had carried him through the evening hesitated for the first time. Rather than admitting uncertainty, he forced a laugh and decided to entertain the room instead. With a playful wave of his hand, he gestured toward Grace Carter, who stood quietly nearby with a serving tray. Smirking, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe she can tell you. After all, she's standing close enough to it." A few guests chuckled, others laughed openly, and the joke spread around the table as though there were nothing unusual about making the evening's quietest employee the subject of amusement. Grace remained still, showing no reaction beyond the calm expression she had worn all night. But within moments, that simple question about a wine bottle would begin a chain of events that none of the distinguished guests, and certainly not Ethan Caldwell himself, could have imagined. No one expected what happened next. For a few seconds after the laughter faded, the atmosphere around the table seemed to recover its elegance. Glasses clinked softly, conversations resumed, and several guests returned their attention to the documents waiting beside their plates. Ethan Caldwell leaned comfortably into his chair, convinced that his remark had entertained everyone present. Throughout his career, he had built a reputation for speaking without hesitation, and many people around him had grown accustomed to laughing simply because he expected them to. Success had insulated him from disagreement, and wealth had surrounded him with individuals who confused confidence with wisdom. Looking toward Grace Carter once more, he gave a dismissive smile before shaking his head. "She's too dumb," he said, this time with even greater certainty, as though he had delivered an obvious fact that required no explanation. Without waiting for a response, he snapped his fingers and pointed toward the far end of the dining room. "Forget the bottle. Go bring more bread." His voice carried across the table with the authority of someone who believed every instruction should be obeyed immediately. Several guests laughed again, some politely and others more openly, eager to remain in the good graces of the host whose signature could influence their own financial future. A few lowered their eyes, perhaps uncomfortable with the remark, yet none chose to challenge it. In that room filled with accomplished executives and respected leaders, silence proved easier than courage. Grace Carter acknowledged the instruction with a quiet nod and turned toward the kitchen without a single word of protest. Her expression remained composed, revealing nothing of what she might have been thinking. Years of experience had taught her that people often reveal themselves when they underestimate others, and she had learned the value of patience. As she walked away, the laughter behind her gradually disappeared beneath renewed business discussions, but the memory of those words followed her. For everyone else gathered around that table, it had been another careless joke from a wealthy man known for his sharp tongue. They would likely forget it before dessert arrived. For Grace, however, it was another reminder that appearances can deceive. She understood that many people looked at uniforms before they looked at character, and salaries before they considered experience. Long before entering Ethan Caldwell's mansion, she had encountered strangers who assumed they knew her story simply by observing her occupation. They saw someone serving food and immediately imagined a limited education, limited ambition, and limited ability. Very few ever paused long enough to ask a question, and even fewer cared enough to listen to the answer. Yet despite the humiliation she had just endured, there was no anger in her movements and no visible resentment on her face. She carried the bread basket back toward the dining room with the same professionalism she had shown all evening, placing it gently on the table before stepping aside once again, becoming almost invisible in a room where everyone believed they understood exactly who she was. Then the conversation unexpectedly returned to the bottle that had started the entire exchange. The foreign executive lifted it once more and smiled politely before repeating his earlier question, this time speaking slowly in his native language while looking around the table for anyone willing to answer. The room became noticeably quieter. One executive adjusted his glasses and looked toward another guest. A diplomat smiled awkwardly before reaching for his water instead of responding. Several investors stared at the unfamiliar writing on the label, hoping someone else possessed the knowledge they lacked. Ethan Caldwell attempted to maintain his confident expression, but the certainty that had filled his voice moments earlier began to fade. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, growing more uncomfortable with each passing second. Millions of dollars rested on relationships built across cultures, yet in that moment, none of the distinguished guests could bridge the simplest linguistic gap. Every eye eventually settled in different directions, searching for an answer that refused to appear. Standing quietly beside the wall, Grace Carter listened carefully as the foreign executive repeated his question one final time. Then Grace Carter politely spoke. The words left Grace Carter's mouth with such calm precision that for a moment, several people around the table wondered if they had misunderstood what they had just heard. Her pronunciation was flawless, her tone respectful, and her explanation of the inscription on the bottle was so detailed that the foreign executive slowly lowered the wine into his hands and stared at her with genuine surprise. She did not hesitate, search for vocabulary, or ask for clarification. Instead, she translated every phrase naturally before explaining the historical meaning behind the label and the vineyard that had produced it decades earlier. The executive's eyebrows lifted as he glanced toward Ethan Caldwell, expecting him to smile with satisfaction that one of his employees possessed such knowledge. Instead, Ethan remained motionless, his confident expression fading into visible confusion. Only minutes earlier, he had dismissed her intelligence in front of the room. Yet now the same woman was speaking with an ease that none of the accomplished executives seated at his table could match. The laughter that had filled the dining room disappeared so completely that the sound of silverware resting against porcelain suddenly seemed unusually loud. Several guests who had looked past Grace all evening now found themselves studying her face as though they were seeing her for the first time. The foreign executive, still smiling, decided to continue the conversation. Rather than switching back to English, he asked another question in his native language, this time more complicated than the first. Grace listened carefully and responded immediately. Her answer was not short or uncertain, but thoughtful, accurate, and delivered with remarkable confidence. The executive nodded approvingly before turning to another guest seated beside him and speaking in a different language entirely. Without changing her expression, Grace answered once again, matching his words with the same effortless fluency she had demonstrated moments earlier. Around the table, conversations stopped one after another until the only exchange taking place was between the quiet maid and the distinguished visitors. One investor slowly lowered his fork without taking another bite. A diplomat leaned forward in his chair. An attorney who had spent years negotiating international contracts removed his glasses and watched silently, unable to hide his curiosity. Even those who understood none of the languages being spoken recognized something extraordinary unfolding before them. Ethan Caldwell glanced from one guest to another, hoping someone would interrupt the exchange or laugh as they had before, but nobody did. The room had shifted in a way he could neither control nor explain. The executive's interest quickly turned into fascination. He smiled warmly and decided to test Grace further, not out of mockery, but out of genuine disbelief. He greeted her in another language, expecting at least a brief hesitation. Instead, she returned the greeting naturally and continued the conversation. Another executive joined in, speaking from the opposite side of the table in yet another language, and once again Grace answered without pause. The questions became increasingly complex, moving beyond simple greetings into discussions of culture, history, and business etiquette. She adjusted her pronunciation and manner of speaking with each exchange so smoothly that it seemed less like translation and more like she had spent years living among the people addressing her. The executives exchanged astonished glances while several guests quietly whispered among themselves, trying to guess how many languages she actually knew. Ethan Caldwell remained frozen, his mind returning to the words he had spoken only moments earlier. The confidence that usually defined him had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable realization that the assumptions guiding his judgment had begun to collapse in front of everyone whose respect he valued. The same guests who had laughed with him were now watching Grace with admiration and him with growing uncertainty. As the conversation continued, Grace never displayed arrogance or satisfaction. She did not attempt to embarrass Ethan or remind anyone of the insults she had endured. She simply answered each question with professionalism humility, and remarkable knowledge, as though this extraordinary ability were an ordinary part of her daily life. That quiet dignity affected the room even more than her linguistic talent. People who had ignored her while she carried serving trays now listened carefully to every word she spoke. One executive shook his head in amazement, while another smiled and remarked that he had rarely encountered someone capable of moving so comfortably between cultures. The atmosphere that had once celebrated wealth and status now revolved around a woman whose value no one had bothered to discover until circumstance forced them to pay attention. Yet even as astonishment spread across the dining room, an even greater mystery remained unanswered. Everyone was asking themselves the same question. If Grace Carter possessed such remarkable education and ability, why was she working quietly as a maid in Ethan Caldwell's mansion? But the biggest surprise wasn't her languages. As the astonishment settled over the dining room, the conversation shifted away from business and toward a mystery that no financial report or investment portfolio could explain. The executives no longer cared about the vintage wine or the documents waiting for signatures. Their attention had turned entirely to Grace Carter, the woman who had quietly served their meals only moments before. Questions filled the room, though many remained unspoken. How had someone with such remarkable abilities ended up carrying trays instead of leading negotiations? Why had she hidden talents that could easily command respect in boardrooms around the world? Even Ethan Caldwell, who had spent years believing he could understand a person within seconds of meeting them, found himself searching for answers that refused to appear. Grace, however, showed no interest in becoming the center of attention. She simply stood with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the evening, allowing silence to fill the spaces where others expected explanations. It was a silence shaped by experience, because some stories are not told quickly. They are built over years of sacrifice, disappointment, and choices made when no good options remain. Years before anyone at that table had heard the name Grace Carter, her life had followed a path that seemed destined for something entirely different. She had devoted herself to education with uncommon determination, studying languages and international communication with the belief that understanding people from different cultures could open doors that politics and business often kept closed. Her studies eventually carried her beyond the United States, where she spent years living and working in different countries, adapting to unfamiliar customs and learning that every language offered another way to understand the world. She accepted opportunities wherever they appeared, sometimes teaching, sometimes assisting international organizations, and sometimes working alongside professionals whose careers revolved around diplomacy and global commerce. Every new place expanded her knowledge and strengthened her confidence, yet none of those experiences taught her the lesson that would later define her life. Success, she discovered, can disappear much faster than it arrives. A single phone call from home interrupted everything she had carefully built. The details remained known only to a handful of people, but those closest to her understood that her family had suffered a devastating tragedy that demanded her return. Dreams that had taken years to build suddenly became secondary to responsibilities she could not ignore. Returning home meant leaving behind opportunities that many people spend entire lifetimes chasing. Employment contracts expired, professional connections faded, and the career she had worked so hard to establish slowly slipped beyond reach. The financial stability she once enjoyed disappeared under growing obligations, and every month brought another difficult decision between preserving her future and protecting the people she loved. At the center of those responsibilities was a close relative whose serious illness required constant care, expensive treatment, and unwavering commitment. Grace never spoke publicly about those years because she believed sacrifice should not become a performance-seeking sympathy. She accepted extra work wherever she could find it, often holding multiple jobs while managing appointments, medications, and household expenses. The qualifications that had once earned admiration overseas meant little when immediate survival became the priority. Employers rarely asked about the chapters of her life that came before her application. They simply saw someone willing to work hard, arrive early, and leave late. And so, one position led to another until she eventually accepted housekeeping work, not because it reflected her ability, but because it provided steady income when stability mattered more than pride. The woman who could communicate across cultures found herself polishing silverware, and preparing dining rooms for strangers who never imagined the journey that had brought her there. What made Grace extraordinary was not merely her education, but the dignity with which she carried burdens that might have discouraged others. She never introduced herself by listing accomplishments she could no longer use, never corrected assumptions made by those who underestimated her, and never demanded recognition for sacrifices that few people knew existed. She understood that life can change direction without asking permission, and she chose to measure herself by character rather than occupation. While others judged her by a uniform, she quietly continued learning, reading, and preserving the knowledge she had spent years acquiring because she believed education belonged to the person, not the position. She never lost her education, only her opportunity. Yet as admiration for Grace spread around the table and the guests slowly realized how profoundly they had misjudged her, one truth remained hidden from Ethan Caldwell. In his attempt to embarrass the quietest person in the room, he had made a mistake whose consequences extended far beyond a careless joke. The billionaire still hadn't realized his biggest mistake. The revelation of Grace Carter's extraordinary abilities should have been enough to make the evening unforgettable, but the dinner was far from over. In fact, the most important reason everyone had gathered inside Ethan Caldwell's mansion had not yet been accomplished. The elegant meal, the expensive wine, and the carefully rehearsed conversations had all been arranged to secure a final international agreement that Ethan believed would become the defining achievement of his career. Months of negotiations had led to this night, and only a few signatures remained before millions of dollars in investments would begin moving across borders. The documents rested neatly inside leather folders placed beside the foreign delegation, waiting for one final review before they were signed. The atmosphere slowly returned to business, but something had changed. The confidence that had once belonged entirely to Ethan now seemed to follow Grace wherever she stood. Several guests who had ignored her earlier now watched her with curiosity, while others quietly replayed the uncomfortable joke they had laughed at only minutes before. Ethan attempted to regain control of the evening, smiling as though nothing unusual had happened, but beneath that smile was a growing uneasiness that refused to disappear. Just as the lead foreign investor opened the agreement for a final reading, his expression changed. He paused midway through a paragraph and exchanged a concerned look with another member of his delegation. They began discussing a particular clause among themselves in their own language, pointing repeatedly to the same section of the document. The room fell silent once again, though this silence felt different. It carried uncertainty rather than embarrassment. One attorney leaned forward and adjusted his glasses while another executive reached for his own copy of the agreement. Ethan, sensing hesitation, confidently assured everyone that the contract had already been reviewed by experienced legal teams and that there was nothing to worry about. Yet the discussion among the foreign investors continued, growing longer and more serious with every passing moment. One of them finally looked toward Ethan and explained that the wording they were reading appeared to create a commitment far broader than what had been negotiated during previous meetings. If interpreted literally, the clause could expose their company to obligations they had never agreed to accept. Another investor nodded in agreement, adding that the translation they had received suggested an entirely different meaning from the one Ethan's team believed was written. Around the table, optimism quickly gave way to concern. The deal that had seemed certain only moments earlier suddenly stood on uncertain ground. As attorneys began comparing documents and executives debated technical language, Grace Carter remained quietly beside the wall, listening without interruption. She did not step forward or attempt to insert herself into the discussion. Instead, she carefully followed the exchange until one particular phrase caught her attention. It was a subtle expression, a combination of words that appeared harmless when translated directly, but carried a completely different legal implication within the cultural and linguistic context of the foreign delegation. Grace understood that the disagreement was not about numbers or intentions, but about interpretation. After waiting respectfully for a pause in the conversation, she politely asked whether she might examine the document. The request surprised everyone, especially Ethan, whose first instinct was to object. But before he could speak, the lead investor handed the agreement to her with visible confidence. Grace studied the paragraph for only a few moments before calmly explaining that the translation used by the drafting team had overlooked an important nuance. The phrase in question, while technically accurate word for word, communicated a level of obligation that native speakers would naturally interpret very differently. She then suggested an alternative wording that preserved the original intent while eliminating the misunderstanding entirely. The room became silent as attorneys on both sides immediately reviewed her explanation. One by one, they reached the same conclusion. She was correct. The realization spread across the table with remarkable speed. The legal advisors nodded in agreement. The foreign investors smiled with relief, and the executives who had spent months preparing the agreement acknowledged that a simple translation issue could indeed have jeopardized the entire partnership. Had the documents been signed without correction, disagreements would almost certainly have emerged later, placing millions of dollars and years of cooperation at risk. Instead, because Grace Carter recognized a subtle difference that everyone else had overlooked, the problem was resolved before the signatures were placed on paper. The revised wording satisfied both delegations, and the atmosphere transformed from anxiety into gratitude. Several foreign executives personally thanked Grace for her insight, praising not only her language skills, but also her understanding of cultural context and professional diplomacy. Ethan Caldwell, however, found himself struggling to speak. The certainty that had defined him throughout the evening had disappeared completely. Only hours earlier he had dismissed Grace as someone unworthy of respect, yet now the very success of his most important business deal rested on her knowledge. Around the table, the guests who had laughed at his remarks avoided looking in his direction. Some stared at their plates, others busied themselves with their papers, unwilling to relive the moment they had joined in mocking the woman who had just saved the evening. Ethan understood that money could purchase magnificent homes, rare artwork, and influential friendships, but it could not erase what everyone in that room had witnessed. And although the agreement had been saved, the most uncomfortable moment of the night was still waiting for him. But one final moment would embarrass him even more. By the time dessert had been cleared from the table, the atmosphere inside Ethan Caldwell's mansion no longer resembled the confident celebration that had begun earlier that evening. The contracts that only hours before seemed destined to collapse had now been signed. Handshakes had been exchanged, and smiles had returned to the faces of the foreign investors. Conversations that once centered around profit margins and expansion strategies had shifted toward the remarkable woman whose quiet intervention had protected an agreement worth millions of dollars. Several executives who had barely acknowledged Grace Carter's presence at the beginning of the evening now spoke of her with genuine admiration, while others privately questioned how someone with such extraordinary knowledge had remained unnoticed for so long. Ethan moved through the room, thanking his guests, but his words lacked the certainty that had always defined him. Every compliment directed toward the successful negotiations reminded him that the evening had been rescued not by his preparation or confidence, but by the woman he had publicly dismissed. The applause he expected for hosting a flawless event had quietly become appreciation for someone whose name most of his guests had not known until that night. As the final guests prepared to leave, Ethan noticed Grace gathering serving trays and organizing the dining room with the same professionalism she had shown from the beginning. She neither sought recognition nor joined the conversations celebrating her contribution. She simply continued working, treating the extraordinary events of the evening as though they were no different from any other shift. For the first time in many years, Ethan hesitated before approaching an employee. He waited until the room had nearly emptied and then walked toward her without the audience that had once encouraged his confidence. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of the arrogance that had accompanied his earlier remarks. He thanked Grace for what she had done and admitted that without her assistance the agreement might never have been completed. Then, believing that money could repair what pride had damaged, he made an offer. He promised an immediate promotion to a senior position within one of his international divisions. He offered a generous bonus far beyond her annual salary and assured her that a better office, better benefits, and a completely different future could be arranged as quickly as she accepted. To Ethan, this was an extraordinary gesture. Throughout his career, he had solved countless problems by writing larger checks or offering greater opportunities. He expected gratitude, perhaps even excitement, convinced that his generosity would erase the memory of his earlier humiliation. Grace Carter listened respectfully without interrupting. When Ethan finished speaking, She thanked him for the offer with genuine courtesy. There was no anger in her voice and no desire to embarrass him in return. She simply looked at him with the calm expression that had remained unchanged throughout the evening and gently shook her head. She explained that promotions and bonuses were valuable, but they could never replace something that should have existed from the very beginning. Then she spoke the words that would remain with everyone who later heard the story. Respect should never arrive after embarrassment. The sentence was delivered without accusation, yet it carried more weight than any argument or public confrontation could have achieved. Ethan searched for a response, but none came. For perhaps the first time in years, he understood that there are moments when wealth cannot purchase forgiveness and status cannot rewrite the past. Grace picked up the final tray from the table and walked toward the service hallway with quiet dignity, leaving behind a silence that no one attempted to break. A few of the foreign investors, having paused near the entrance while waiting for their transportation, had witnessed the exchange from a respectful distance. Without drawing attention to themselves, they began to applaud softly. It was not the loud applause reserved for speeches or celebrations, but the quiet acknowledgement given to someone whose character had spoken louder than any accomplishment listed on a resume. One by one, others joined them until the sound echoed gently through the grand dining room. None of the applause was directed toward Ethan Caldwell, despite the mansion, the luxurious dinner, or the successful business deal. It belonged entirely to Grace Carter, the woman many had overlooked only hours earlier. Ethan remained standing where he was, watching as she disappeared from view. The executives who had laughed at his jokes earlier in the evening now avoided meeting his eyes, remembering too clearly the words they had encouraged with their laughter. In that moment, surrounded by priceless artwork, rare wines, and unimaginable wealth, Ethan Caldwell felt smaller than he ever had inside his own home. The confidence that had once colored his face gave way to unmistakable embarrassment, and his face turned red. The wealthiest man in the room discovered that intelligence doesn't always wear an expensive suit. As the lights inside Ethan Caldwell's mansion slowly dimmed and the last luxury vehicles disappeared through the front gates, the evening left behind something far more valuable than a signed business agreement. The contracts would eventually become another chapter in a successful career. The expensive wine would be replaced by another rare collection, and the guests would move on to their next meetings and celebrations. But the lesson that unfolded around that dining table would remain with everyone who witnessed it. Hours earlier, the room had been divided by wealth, titles, expensive clothing, and social status. The people with authority occupied the finest seats, while the woman serving them existed only in the background. Yet when the moment of truth arrived, none of the impressive resumes, luxury watches, or powerful connections could solve the problem that threatened the entire evening. The answer came from the person who had been underestimated from the moment she entered the room. Grace Carter never demanded attention, never introduced herself by listing her accomplishments, and never sought revenge against those who laughed at her. She simply allowed her knowledge, discipline, and character to speak when the opportunity finally arrived. In doing so, she changed not only the outcome of a business deal, but also the way an entire room viewed success and human worth. Stories like this remind us that life often hides extraordinary people behind ordinary circumstances. A uniform cannot measure intelligence. A paycheck cannot measure wisdom. A job title cannot reveal someone's sacrifices, education, or resilience. Many people carry invisible stories that the world never pauses long enough to discover. Some are caring for struggling families, while quietly working multiple jobs. Others have left successful careers behind to honor responsibilities that matter more than recognition. Still others possess remarkable talents, but simply never receive the opportunity to display them because society has already decided who they are based on appearance alone. Ethan Caldwell believed he could judge a person within seconds, but one evening exposed the limits of that confidence. The greatest mistake he made was not failing to understand 8 languages. It was failing to understand another human being. Grace Carter, on the other hand, proved that humility often reveals true greatness. She walked into that mansion as an employee and left with something that money cannot purchase: the respect of every honest person in the room. She never asked for applause, yet she earned it. She never asked for admiration, yet she inspired it. And perhaps the most powerful part of her story is that she remained exactly the same person before and after everyone recognized her abilities. The only thing that changed was the way others chose to see her. As you reflect on everything that happened that evening, imagine yourself sitting at that table. Would you have laughed with the crowd when Ethan Caldwell dismissed Grace Carter? Or would you have questioned the assumptions everyone else accepted without hesitation? Would you have spoken up when someone was being humiliated? Or would you have remained silent because it seemed easier? Every one of us eventually encounters moments that reveal our character more than our words ever can, and those moments often arrive without warning. Share your thoughts in the comments below because your perspective may encourage someone else to see people differently. And if this story surprised you, you'll want to hear our next unbelievable true-to-life inspired story about the millionaire who fired a janitor, only to discover who he really was. You won't want to miss what happened next.